Tonight, we're going back on tour. So a few weeks ago, people might have seen the show that we did from Liverpool, which was really good. Actually, it was excellent. And the idea behind sort of taking this program, which obviously at times we're just talking about certain issues, but the idea of taking it kind of on tour and taking it around the country was that I always felt like, you know, in the last kind of 5-6 years, I've met so many fantastic activists around the country, and you know, and some people you hear plenty of, you'll see them on programs, news on Novara Media, all sorts of stuff like that. And some people don't get a hearing, and I think there's so many great people out there that really have got a lot to say and a lot to kind of add in terms of kind of organising and rebuilding the left. So the idea behind this kind of on tour status is that every now and again we go around and we kind of pick a place, and then we talk to some really fantastic activists there, and we have got some great activists tonight. The idea of Pint and Politics is that we sit and we have a bit of a chat, just as we would do in the pub or cafe or whatever. No compulsion to drink alcohol, but I've got a pint of what's called Bounty Hunter. It's brewed by my local Durham brewery, and it's actually a chocolate and coconut porter, would you believe? Yes. So I haven't tasted it yet, but I think it's going to be nice. And so tonight we have Rhiannon Lockley, who is somebody I've known for a long time, actually. She's branch secretary at Birmingham City University. She's a socialist, she's a trade union activist, and she's also a foundation year lecturer there. She writes a blog, actually, 100 Miles from the Sea, which I recommend. And if you get a chance to have a look. I did notice, Rhiannon, you haven't, it was a bit out of date. I think it was like June or something last year, but but yeah, definitely go and have a look at that, because there's some good historical articles as well. What are you drinking tonight, Rhiannon? Just unmute, sorry.
I don't know if you can see that glass of red wine, but it's sort of blurring into my background. So
oh yeah. That's always a problem with the backgrounds, isn't it? I want to have a pub one, so I'm sitting in a nice pub, but I know it'll squash my head. So, and you need a green screen apparently, I think. Okay, so next we have Ollie Armstrong, who's a socialist and a local Labour councillor from in Northfield. Ollie, you've also been involved in World Transformed in Birmingham. I remember seeing you organising big things over the last kind of year or two. And you're also involved in Labour for a Green New Deal, aren't you?
I am, yeah. I am. I'm also... I feel a bit like Rhiannon's glass of red wine, like blurring in and out. I've got the classic long COVID, so I have to get my apologies in early here if I become incoherent. I'm also drinking a little bit of whiskey, which possibly isn't the best thing to have when you've got long COVID. But we'll experiment with that this evening.
That is nice. And those of you who are alert to these things will notice that Ollie hasn't got a Birmingham accent. So where you're from up my way, aren't you?
Yeah. So I've spent half my life in North Shields on the northeast coast, and then I've spent half my life in the West Midlands. Right. 17 years in Birmingham. Yeah. And I've split it.
Yeah, you're adopted son now.
I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I might still be barred from Birmingham. You'd have to
maybe
put the
people
word
could
out.
Maybe people could judge that on Twitter and send you their feedback.
It depends who you ask. Some on the right of the party might say no, get out.
Thanks, Ollie. And also we have Nikki Brennan, who is a Labour councillor as well in Sparkhill. And she's founder of Baby Aid Birmingham, which supports families of 5-year-olds and under in need in Birmingham. I mean, I think you'll probably tell us a bit more about that in the rest of the programme, but I've heard very big things about that.
Yeah, it's something I'm very kind of proud of, but it's taken over my life since the COVID pandemic. It is lovely though.
Yeah. Is that something that's come out of COVID then?
Yeah, it was set up as a response to COVID. And it helps all across Birmingham.
Yeah. Amazing work. I mean, that sort of stuff's happening all over the country, but it's just, I know how much work it takes to firstly build something like that up and then maintain it is just incredible. So like huge respect for that. And Nikki, what are you drinking?
I've got a lovely little glass of what should be called a porn star martini, but M&S won't call it a porn star martini. What have they called it? Passion star martini. And I put it in a little glass to pretend I'm at the pub.
Oh, that is nice. That is very classic. We were supposed to be joined by Jovan Nepal tonight as well, but unfortunately he can't make it. He's got a family commitment. But I really had a look at Jovan's kind of social media and the things that he's done, and I would love to get him on at a later date. But we have got a really excellent replacement in it. He's also got family commitments, but he's going to be able to make it, as in putting kids to bed and things. But he's going to be able to make it a bit later. So I'll introduce Dharminder Chauhan later on. Should be coming in about 10 minutes or so. Okay, right. So I think firstly to sort of clear up one or two things that I got into a bit of trouble when we were talking about this program about the Black Country in Birmingham, and I think we need to understand that before we start on the kind of serious questions. And Rhiannon, I just wondered whether you could explain a bit about Black Country. Somebody on Twitter actually mentioned that, talked about it in terms of Birmingham being maybe part of the greater Black Country, but is that a bit of a joke?
That was probably someone from the Black Country who said that. So I suppose historically the Black Country is sort of Dudley. It's probably Wolverhampton, although there's often a bit of argy-bargy over that. And then stretching over, you've sort of got Smethwick, Bearwood, and all of that coming towards Birmingham. So the difference is, I suppose, that Birmingham was a city. The Black Country was very industrial, but lots of spread out towns. So the west of Birmingham, for anyone who doesn't know the area that well. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, we've got that cleared up. And also, is there like, because I always have this sort of problem like with the Northeast, because the Northeast is quite a varied place, and people quite often say there's nothing to there's nothing in common between people who live in Sunderland and Newcastle and Durham and so on. And I mean, obviously there are, but is there quite a lot of quite a lot of rivalry between the different areas in West Midlands?
I don't know if I'd call it rivalry. I think on both sides you might get a bit of offence from Brummies if they're mistaken for Uslot, who they call yam-yams.
Yeah, I think it does my head in when people think a Birmingham accent is a Black Country accent, because they're completely different. And it's like, can you not understand? We don't sound the same. But, it drives me mad.
Yeah,
so I get that with North Shields and South Shields. When people say you're from South Shields or from Sunderland, or like, no, it's like that's almost London.
If the thing is as well, for me, like I can tell a difference between a North Birmingham and a South Birmingham accent. If your family's got Irish in it, you speak slightly differently. So. And
then, so a yam-yam is somebody from Birmingham?
No,
right.
Brummie is Birmingham.
From just a Brummie, yeah. Yam-yam is somebody from maybe Dudley.
Black Country.
Right. Okay. Got it. Right. Okay. Thank you. I'm so confused, but it's appalling, really, because I hate it when people come to the Northeast and they don't know this stuff. So, like, I take the punishment on that one. Okay. So, Rhiannon, I wanted to talk to you a bit about Birmingham's history, and obviously we will talk about the Black Country as well as part of that as well. I think it's important. But just to sort of go back and in terms of the kind of, obviously the city and the region has kind of turbulent past in terms of labour movement, industrial history, and also race relations. I think, and we'll talk about that probably as we go on as well. What are the kind of, for you, what would you kind of identify as the key kind of events and movements that socialists should know about?
I think if we're talking about sort of the radical history of Birmingham, the Black Country, as it's International Working Women's Day tomorrow, we have to mention the 1910 Cradley Heath Chainmakers strike, which is a crucial moment in UK labour history as well as local history. The chainmakers went on strike for 10 weeks. A lot of parallels to what's happening under COVID, really, in that they were working whilst in a domestic environment because they worked in their homes. It was a hard industry with kids at home and trying to organise in those conditions, a bit like trying to organise under COVID now. But yeah, they went out for 10 weeks and they got the first minimum wage in the UK. Following on from that, a lot of people's representations of Birmingham is Peaky Blinders, and in there you see Jessie Eden, the organiser who was involved in the general strike, which was pretty big there, and again a big women's organiser. She took 10,000 women out in 1931 over performance-related pay, over speed. So definitely a big thing there. In terms of more generally where the radical tradition comes from, it's about obviously very industrial organising within the Black Country in Birmingham, but also migration. And 1968, I think we'll come back to this. Enoch Powell famously did his Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham. He was a Wolverhampton MP, so that's definitely a defining moment. And 1965, just before that, we had Malcolm X visiting Smethwick after the election of a Tory MP who'd run on a very controversial slogan of, if you want a racial slur for a neighbour, vote a Labour. Following on from that, we've got the 3 degrees in West Brom in the late 70s, really changing how football was. And then Handsworth riots in the 80s, and there's been subsequent riots since then. I think one last thing I would say about how I think of the history here coming from both migration and industrial organising kind of connected together is one of my first memories of Birmingham growing up in the Black Country was going there in the 1980s to see Desmond Tutu for an anti-apartheid event. And I think although we didn't have the internet, migration has meant that in the area there was always a strong connection between different struggles. So my parents were really involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, but also the struggle for a free Palestine, which was connected, and I know it was also connected to the struggles over Northern Ireland and Nicaragua and the Philippines, American occupation. And it's interesting to think that back then a lot of that was to do with people coming and doing these slideshows in little halls and things like that, because there weren't the internet connections that we have now. But definitely the pattern of radical organising amongst migrant workers and so on connected all those things together, I would say, locally.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's such a kind of variety of different kind of influences and so on. And what in terms of you mentioned migration there. What kind of industries were people working in? That people who come from all over the world, and what kind of industries were they working in?
Well, there's different, I suppose, patterns across different parts of Birmingham and the Black Country. Certainly over Wolverhampton, there's a sort of paint and tyres and rubber and stuff like that. The others might be better place to talk about Birmingham, although I know traditionally it's been a heart of munitions and other manufacturing. Yeah.
So there was quite a sort of car industry as well, isn't there, in the West Midlands generally? So Nikki, if you were gonna, like, I mean, if I hadn't heard of much about Birmingham and West Midlands history, who are the kind of key people that you would pick out as being important to know about, and in terms of kind of this kind of socialist history of the area?
I think Rhiannon's kind of touched on Jessie Eden, who was kind of, I think a lot of people would have heard of her because she's in Peaky Blinders, even though I think people close to her aren't very happy about the portrayal that they've given her in Peaky Blinders, because they've kind of sexed her up a bit, and you know, they haven't talked about her politics. And when it does come on Peaky Blinders, they always talk about the Sparkhill Communist Party, which always makes me laugh, being Sparkhill's councillor. I think it's quite a difficult one to answer, because in school and around us, we don't really have that education of who is important to Birmingham. We hear a lot about Joseph Chamberlain and the Cadbury family, but it took me to university to hear anything about kind of socialist history of Birmingham, and that's because I had a really, really good lecturer who loved it and would take us for site visits. It just seems that it's like something that Birmingham's a bit kind of, I don't know, it's weird. Birmingham, people are a bit apathetic here. We don't like to shout about our achievements, especially political, and I really don't think that's helped our political scene at all. I think if you look at the Cadbury family, although you could say he's a massive capitalist because he had chocolate and it was for profit, I think if you look at the way George Cadbury looked after his staff and built Bourneville, where I live now, there's like a lasting legacy. My children went to the nursery that they built. We've got the big estate. There's a swimming pool. There's a big housing trust that was for the workers at Bourneville. I don't think that was in many places in the country. So that's something to be proud of. But looking at the Cadbury family, you really want to look at Beatrice Cadbury, who was actually quite upset about being wealthy and gave all her shares to the workers at Cadbury so they could have more of a say in what happened at the company.
Right. Okay. And so quite a lot of the education that you have in terms of, you know, local history and things at school would be around kind of, you know, kind of liberal figures. And is that right? It's kind of like a, yeah. So I think I saw something along the lines of kind of Birmingham being, you know, the UK's sort of preeminent liberal city, you know, in its history and so on.
It's quite funny. It's quite funny as well. Like where I'm a councillor for, there's just been this fantastic oral history project where they've talked to everybody along a road called the Stratford Road about immigration, and they've brought a school in to do it. And I've not really seen but Andy Jolly did it. I'll give him a shout out on here. And it was absolutely fantastic. And it was like how all these different people came to Birmingham and lived together along the Stratford Road. It was great, but we don't really see loads of it, and definitely not high profile.
Yeah. Ollie, sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, just to say, and I think that whole dearth of a politics or a political knowledge in Birmingham, I think is kind of deliberate. So I think there's there's a constant deliberate killing off of any kind of desire for political knowledge, and I think that's just to kind of keep a kind of hollow politics in Birmingham. I mean, that's my perspective on it. That actually, when you start digging, there's loads of fantastic work and fantastic people. But I think it kind of just holds a status quo, right? Like the more I've got involved in the Labour Party in Birmingham, and there's fantastic people in it, but it just seems it's habitual to make it almost non-political, like to hollow it out, so that you know, you kind of stay quiet.
There's like a culture of people don't like to celebrate the good things in Birmingham at all. It's definitely something. I don't know whether it's just a Birmingham thing, just generally we don't like to kind of big ourselves up or say these really good things have happened. Looking at like our council as well, we had a really fantastic, the only woman leader of Birmingham City Council, Teresa Stewart. She's just died. And lots of people hadn't heard of her before. I know her because she was in my local CLP, and she was a wonderful woman that really empowered women. But even with her, there isn't enough kind of emphasis on what she achieved and how brilliant she was. You know, there should be a lot more done.
I mean, I was talking to a few weeks ago. I had the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign on, and I was speaking to people in there, and they said that even people who were brought up very close to Orgreave really knew nothing about it. Sort of it wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't really talked about much in communities. And then when you kind of unearth it, you realise there's a whole kind of tradition, and then people obviously go further back into that mining history and all sorts of kind of strikes and awful accidents that have happened throughout the years, and you kind of dig deeper into it, and I think that's quite common across the country, isn't it?
Definitely. And just to link to that, actually, something that I didn't mention was when we think of the miners' strike, generally we think of the 80s and the battering and the defeat, but Birmingham had a big a moment of triumph for the working class in 1972 with the Battle of Saltley Gate, which was when the depot was picketed successfully to stop the reserves going out, and they won a dispute they never expected to win the NUM, but we don't talk about that locally at all either.
Yeah. I just noticed Daminda Chauhan's come into the room, and welcome, Daminda. It's really good to see you.
Hello, everyone.
I'm sorry kind of to chuck you straight in. I know you've been putting kids to bed and all sorts of stuff. But I just wanted to introduce you quickly first, because you've got a really obviously interesting role at the moment, and so you're an ESOL lecturer and in UCU chair at Sandwell College, which is in West Bromwich, and you're an anti-racist campaigner and Labour Party activist in Wolverhampton, where you live. But also you've been involved in the campaign to fight the proposed blue plaque for Enoch Powell, and you've been involved in pay and victimisation disputes and campaigns in your college as well. So welcome. It's really good to have you, and thanks so much for coming on at very late notice.
No problem. Thank you.
Have you managed to get yourself a drink at all?
I've had a cup of tea.
You got a nice cup of tea.
Yeah. What question were you on?
But yeah, I wonder whether you wanted to add anything, because we've been talking about kind of Birmingham and the West Midland Black Country kind of history, and obviously you've been involved in that campaign around Enoch Powell. That's kind of quite a significant thing that always comes to people's minds when they think about about Birmingham's history, and then and also the stuff around Smethwick and as well. And I just wondered whether you could sort of give us an idea, because we're thinking about how that might affect politics as we are today in West Midlands.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's go back to 1964 election in Smethwick. Peter Griffiths, he won. I think he got 47% of the vote. Labour lost. It was a big blow for Labour at that time. Not many people know this as well. The Ku Klux Klan, the UK branch of the Ku Klux Klan, was actually formed at that time. And I forget the name of the pub now. They used to meet. So it was in that sort of background. I think what was happening in Smethwick at that time, there was a number of factory closures. There was shortage of housing, and as always, that was made into a race issue. And Peter Griffiths ran on that platform. Let's blame the newcomers. And it was that sort of led to his victory. And eventually, as you will know, Malcolm X, with his struggles over in the States, that was one of the reasons why he came into I think at that time there was a by-election in 1965 where Labour won. And so Malcolm X came along to show his support. He came to Britain, I think. He wasn't originally going to speak or come to Birmingham. I think he was going to speak at one of the London universities, and they banned him. So I think it was the IWA, Indian Workers Association, for example. Again, not much is known about them, but behind the scenes, they are quite active. I think they invited Malcolm X to Smethwick. He did his famous picture on the street. Yeah, and also, later on, 1968, Rivers of Blood speech. I think you mentioned that. So these two key events are quite big, and they, especially for I think Black history within the West Midlands and sort of anti-racism. The Rivers of Blood speech, Powell and his legacy gets mentioned quite a lot, but of equal importance of people who lived through those times was the 1964 election as well. Within Wolverhampton, I mean, my family, people I know directly now, actually, for the 60s, there was a ban of turbans on the buses. My background, by the way, is Sikh. So what happened when Sikh immigrants came to the UK to get employment, what they would do was cut their hair. So when they were going into factories, they would cut their hair. And I think in the 1960s, one bold Sikh bus driver in Wolverhampton decided, right, I'm going to keep my hair. And he was disciplined for it. And eventually that led to a sort of whole campaign. And eventually, that was 4-1. Again, I think beyond the Sikhs community, advertise enough. So I mean, those are quite important. As Rhiannon said, Otley Gate, previous to that, Chainmakers, and Mary MacArthur.
Yeah,
they're the ones that come to
the Indian Workers Association. They were quite big, weren't they? And there was various kind of areas of the country where they were really well organised, and Birmingham was one, wasn't it? I think actually there was different kind of varieties of the Indian Workers Association, wasn't there? There was one that was linked to, I think, maybe the IMG, the International Marxist Group, or something. I can't remember the exact details, but there was also, they were involved in the Imperial Typewriters strike in Leicester as well, and then there was quite a lot of activity in West London as well, Southall and places as well.
That's right.
Are they quite a significant group then in kind of the defence against, kind of the racism of Powell and people? And
yes, I think if you look at the sort of very early days of in the UK, all the Asians that first came to this country were self-organising when they suffered oppression in the workplace. Trade unions, oddly enough, weren't the first places they went to. They were self-organising, so community action for groups, and Indian Workers Organisation Association was part of that. So it helped, became a hub. I mean, Southall, you mentioned, was probably the area where they were probably most organised in the UK. And I think that's all. That activism spread to areas like Birmingham, Leicester, Wolverhampton.
Yeah. And I just also wanted just to kind of mention the Handsworth riots, or if you call it a riot, uprising, and what because obviously people might not have heard of that. Was that they were kind of within 1985? That's right, isn't it?
Yeah,
81, and then again in 85.
All right, two, right. And so, what actually happened there? Do you know? Anybody can kind of fill me in on that?
Well, from what I can remember, there was an altercation with police, and I think there's a cafe in Lozells. Is that right? And it's something quite minor, and it eventually just got out of hand. I think it was over a parking ticket or something mundane as that, and that just triggered off. That was a spark for it.
Yeah.
I think the Brixton riots obviously had happened around the same sort of time as the first lot, but I think while the mainstream media sort of portrayed it as copycat action and so on, Pogus Caesar has done some really good work, or did some really good work photographing it and so on, which I would definitely recommend people look at and documenting it aside from the mainstream media. And I suppose what happened was not so much copycat as the same conditions that were going on in Brixton in terms of really anti-black policing were happening in Handsworth as well. And alongside that, it was definitely a target for the National Front at that point in time in terms of the sort of things that Dom talked about in Smethwick, the sort of housing stuff and all that kind of thing. They were trying very much to sort of to portray the people of Handsworth as being sort of hooligans and people who were against a peaceful state. And the reality was that it was the far right coming in to try and make trouble, and the police not not treating people with humanity or respect.
Yeah.
We've got to remember as well, this is at the height of Thatcherism. So unemployment was rife. Housing, that housing stock wasn't being invested in. Inner cities were dwindling, and we've got to remember that backdrop as well. Yeah.
And we're facing that now, right? Like that, all those same tensions, all those same splits and fractures. And just talking about Enoch Powell, there's a pub beside where I am now in South Birmingham, and they had a picture of Enoch Powell until less than a year ago on the wall, and that same pub at the last election, I had some friends come up from London to campaign, and we were in there having food. It's a pub I'd be in really regularly, but obviously me looking like me, so we had these volunteers in there, and we suddenly got told you're not welcome, got told to get out. And the only difference between me normally being there and my friends being in, they were black and Asian. And then this was when, a year and a half ago, middle of Northfield, and then they were chanting white power, and Enoch was right. And it didn't go challenged by anyone else in the pub. And actually we made the decision at that time to calmly leave. I spoke to the blokes shouting it, said it's totally uncalled for, but my friends who were there, we talked and we said, look, we'll just leave, and they kind of shouted at us as we went. But there's a real danger, isn't there? And we're saying it with the dog whistle politics of the government. And our local MP, who's newly elected Conservative, over COVID, he was using dog whistle tactics of saying, oh, we don't need lockdown because it's these areas here.
Yeah, it was the community that I represent that he was going for. And it was quite funny actually when Northfield's rates massively increased and my area I represent massively decreased, and I was like, well, it's not all the mosques, is it? Actually, it's that's just what COVID is.
Well, the irony was the MP was blaming other areas in a kind of dog whistle racist intent, in my opinion. But then I think because people in my area thought, oh well, it's not us, they all went out, and then we had this big spike, and it's just so. But yeah, my point is we're right on the edge of that same kind of tinderbox, aren't we, of right wing intent.
You have to think with the Handsworth riots as well. It wasn't just 1 year. There's like different occasions where there was Handsworth riots, even up to 2011. I think the last ones were. Right. And you just see people being demonised completely by the right wing press about what's going on. I lived over there at one point. It was 2011. I lived in Winson Green. It was complete. What was going on was completely different from what was being portrayed on the TV. Yeah,
and is there a kind of organised far right presence then in across the West Midlands, or are we still talking, that kind of dog whistle politics? And but we're not actually. I mean, it's hard, isn't it? Because it's hard to say, isn't it, under COVID, whether there would be people marching through the streets. But obviously, with that kind of history, you're always aware, aren't you, that might come back.
There are pockets. What I would say is, over the last couple of decades, Dudley, which is near where I live, was definitely a big target for the far right because of plans over building a mosque. So we had a lot of far right action here, and then Birmingham, sort of towards the end of the noughties, going into the tens, became more of a target then. But my impression was always that there are pockets of far right here, but it was primarily outside organisers busing large numbers of people into the community who didn't really have that much of a base here. It's more what things like the big they would call it the mega mosque or whatever, symbolises to a far right stretched around the country as a place to come and rally around supposedly terrified indigenous people, which is obviously complete nonsense. And I imagine similarly in Birmingham, from what I've seen from going over there, we've had the EDL, Pegida, the Democratic Lads Alliance, all of those sorts, which mainly seems to be Tommy Robinson outfits of different forms, and he's not a brummy.
I think the EDL have become quite embarrassing when it's come to Birmingham, because you get this kind of, the EDL are coming to Birmingham, there's going to be this big protest, and there's about 5 of them now. Tommy Robinson hasn't been for a while. I remember Britain First come in and he had a little stall and he got more abuse than he did support. People are very vocal in the fact that you're not welcome in Birmingham. We don't want this horrible politics here. I think with like introduction of social media and things, and people feel a bit brave behind a keyboard. I remember in my first year of being a councillor being called a race traitor on a regular basis because I represent a diverse community. But I don't think it's a massive threat. But anybody being fascist or racist is a threat to Birmingham and our community.
And Ollie, obviously there's been resistance to this historical kind of right-wing movements, and also like a response to things like the Handsworth riots from sort of music, in the music sort of tradition of Birmingham. Like for me personally, I kind of know what I do know about the Handsworth riots and so on would be from like bands like Steel Pulse, but there's also specials just down the road in Coventry, the Beat from Birmingham, and then obviously the UB40 as well. How important is the kind of musical tradition? I know you've sort of come in from the northeast, but do you notice that that's a big thing?
Yeah, it definitely it very much is. It is, and actually, not the mystique away, but Ben sent us some of these questions before. So when he sent these, I was thinking about this a lot, and actually, the key thing I wanted to talk about actually wasn't bands from like 30, 40 years ago, which others might jump in at. I just wanted to touch on, Ben, the politics of the music scene in Birmingham 20 years ago and how that overarched in the last 2 elections. So a bit of a kind of slip away from what you're asking. But I found it kind of really inspiring. So I moved to Birmingham to be in a band. So my years as a professional musician. And when I first moved to Birmingham and played around this city and met lots of other bands, they were fantastic, but it didn't feel like there was much political intent. It was kind of like indie rock. The kind of bands I was hanging, there was lots of styles, but the type of bands I was hanging out with, really brilliant, but really it wasn't singing about politics, it wasn't singing about social change. And I think I kind of naively thought, therefore, they didn't care. But one of the things that really inspired me at the last 2 elections, 17 and 19, especially around 19, was the amount of people that I'd been hanging about with who were in their 20s and bands back then, who kind of came out to step up. And it kind of felt like so much of the Birmingham movement around the last 2 elections really pushing for social change were all these kind of crazy musicians and artists that I hadn't actually thought were that, I guess, kind of patronizingly. I thought, maybe you're not that political just because they were singing about this lass or this lad. And actually they're all, obviously it was deeply rooted in who they are, and they all stepped up to get involved in the campaigns and still are now.
Going a bit further back as well, because I'm obviously a bit older than Ollie. One thing that struck me recently was that, I don't know if all of you have seen the Lovers Rock as part of the series, but that reminded me of the blues, which was a big part of Handsworth, definitely sort of blues. Still going now, but I obviously don't know about it from the 80s. I'm not quite that old, but when I moved to Birmingham in 1998, over from as far away as Wolverhampton, it was definitely very, very much politicised. And Nikki's mentioned that 2001, I think that we had more riots in Handsworth then. But the other thing that I would say from that time as well was, if you think about the big club nights like Atomic Jam at the Q Club and the Medicine Bar and so on, a lot of that traced itself to the Criminal Justice Act and you'd see flyers with like repetitive beats on and so on, which was from sort of earlier on in the 90s, what they used, wasn't it, to outlaw raves and so on. So I think going further back, there's a link to all of that in the politics of the Birmingham music scene as well.
Yeah.
I think taking it up to the modern day where you look at grime music as well, I think Birmingham's got a massive grime scene, which is quite political, and it also kind of celebrates how diverse we are. So you've got these rappers that will put different languages in because they're mixed race, and they bring their cultures together. And I think that kind of builds on a lot of what UB40 did. It kind of took reggae and made it for, like, they were from Borsall Heath. It's a migrant area, and they took reggae, they gave it to everybody as an identity, and it was political. And you can see that coming through on the grime scene now in Birmingham too.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and obviously a huge part of, kind of West Midlands radicalism, isn't it? And Dominda, I just realised that I forgot to kind of pick you up on the Enoch Powell plaque stuff. I was just quite interested in that because I didn't know an awful lot about that.
Yeah, are you aware of sort of the blue? You must know what blue plaques are on buildings.
Yeah.
There's a sort of process of how you go about getting these plaques on buildings. In Wolverhampton, we have a Wolverhampton Historical Society, and it was suggested to them that because of Enoch Powell being an MP of Wolverhampton, and because of his usually always is for positive, positive contributions to British society. So someone in their infinite wisdom thought, well, Powell had a good influence in Wolverhampton, the house that he lived in. Why don't we put a blue plaque to commemorate him? So we thought that. We thought, well, absolutely not. Powell doesn't represent what people in Wolverhampton are. The majority of people believe, why we don't want it. That would be divisive. So we sort of launched a campaign against it. Eventually we won. But if you think about what's happening now, actually, or last year, the Black Lives Movement, things about statues and blue plaques, they've actually made it law now. You can't remove any of these. I think only this month, which I think is a bit sad. I'm not advocating tearing down things, but I am advocating for more 360 version of history to be made available. And I think so. If you're going to if there are existing blue plaques that sort of commemorate people who were slave traders, etc., and they only highlight the sort of philanthropy side of their lives, within Britain, maybe we should have put a plaque next to it saying, actually, well, there is this other side to this person as well. And I didn't see that from Priti Patel,
Yeah.
So that's a bit disappointing.
And you kind of ideally want a more kind of democratic process as well. But I suppose when you take on something like that, you're coming up against kind of tradition and bureaucracy, aren't you? So I imagine it was quite a struggle to win that. Yeah,
it many months.
Yeah.
It was a number of people involved. People from councillors, other activists within the city, general public.
Yeah.
Well, just to jump in, I find the whole conversation around not the comment you just made about not advocating for pulling down stuff, and I find that quite interesting. In that, at what point are we allowed to be outraged? At what point is it okay to say enough's enough? And I feel like one of the biggest tricks that centrist politics plays is tricking us into thinking we have to constantly be civil in the face of horrific stuff. I'm all right with people ripping down statues of slavers personally. That might get me in trouble as a councillor, but I just think at some point you've got to hold the line and say, that's fucking awful. We've got to do better than that and stand up for stuff. And that's great that you're fighting to get that blue plaque down. We've got to hold the ground, and it's okay not to be civil in the face of horrible people.
Yeah, it's quite funny how it's okay for people to do horrible things and that be acceptable, but if you're a bit kind of upset or outraged and have action against it, then you're the bad one.
Outraged at the
It's
horrible
bizarre.
Yeah, we've got to be better at being. It's not about like, be kind, but be focused and be outraged. It's okay. We should be outraged. You know, if we're not outraged every day, we're not seeing the world, are we?
Yeah.
It's definitely conflation between freedom of speech and freedom of dissent, isn't it? So freedom of speech means you have the power to intimidate or bully or be malicious to people, but freedom of dissent is increasingly denied in our education system and in the wider sphere. I do think we have to be mindful that when Black people are involved in tearing stuff down, they're going to get much more harsh penalties from the justice system than their white co-parts involved in that stuff.
Yeah. And there's this idea that by tearing down statues, you're getting rid of history, but obviously it doesn't, does it? It's the symbolism of those statues and, you know, things like the blue plaques and so on. It doesn't erase history, and we can still discuss slavery. There's no ban on that. But yeah, I think that's a really kind of interesting debate that's all raised. But thanks for that, and thanks, Ollie. For
quite interesting though, if you think about it. We get a lot of British people don't get taught British history. You know, so I mean, when I did history, so did the Romans in Britain. The 1066 jumped to the Fire of London. And we got to we did the Civil War, and whoops, we jumped right over 300 years of history, and we end up, the origins of the First World War. Yeah. We go, well, what happened to how did we just get from the Civil War to the First World War? We just did. So and it's interesting. People don't question. There aren't enough people say, hang on, why aren't we taught about that missing 300 years? Yeah, when a statue comes down, it's our history. How do you tear down our history? You should also be asking, well, why aren't you taught your own history as well?
Yeah. I just wanted to kind of move forward a little bit, and Ollie, just want to come back to you on this as well. That kind of issue of the Corbyn movement in the West Midlands, and my impression, and you know, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was harder for like the Corbyn project, if you like, to make an impact in Birmingham and the West Midlands and in other cities. I mean, when I was in Liverpool, talking to people in Liverpool recently, they talked about sort of big rallies and kind of great enthusiasm. Is that fair? Would you say? And if it is, what are the kind of reasons behind that?
Can I cheekily pass that over to Nikki? Because Nikki was actually, is that okay, Nikki? Because you were right at the heart of it, actually, and I was more on the outskirts initially. Is that all right?
Yeah. I was involved from 2016. I had a baby in 2015, so I kind of sat that year out of politics and just watched it. But I got very involved in 2016, and it was my first time ever in politics. Before that, I didn't really know you could join a political party, didn't think politics was for me. And I remember someone very close to me saying to me, and I think this is from a Birmingham perspective maybe, "Oh, Bab, don't join the Labour Party. It will break your heart and disappoint you." So there was that kind of level of apathy before I even joined. I think we did have the rallies, and I think people were enthusiastic for it, but Birmingham is like a huge place. I think people kind of forget it's the second city. It's enormous, and like our council covers 10 CLPs, so it's a huge space to kind of organise and get people involved and keep people connected. And you know, I was very proud of the things that we kind of achieved in those years of organising for the Corbyn left in Birmingham. An organisation called South Birmingham Momentum that I was involved in was very, very active, and we did some fantastic campaigns and some fantastic organising. But, you know, I don't think it had that foundation to start with, and it was very fractured from the beginning. You had a lot of kind of personalities at play. There wasn't that kind of common solidarity. And there was kind of a push from organisers to make it about just organising in the Labour Party. But if you don't kind of have the numbers already, it's very difficult to make a huge difference. And we didn't kind of branch out enough into community organising. So like your proper community organising and bringing people on board from that. So I think we started and it was great, but there wasn't a proper foundation for us. The right in Birmingham, it is very established, it's very organised, and it's very difficult to go up against something like that when you're such a new kind of organisation.
The roots have been ripped out already, haven't they, Nikki? Like the roots have been ripped right out before.
It's really sad, because now I feel like everything that we built up over those 4 years is now gone. And people have lost trust as well. And I think people are still devastated by the 2019 election. And they just kind of haven't got it together to get back involved again in Labour. And I don't think maybe the direction that the leadership has taken has helped either. And it's quite difficult trying to say to friends who are political, maybe not party political, that, you know, this is the place you need to be. You need to organise in the Labour Party. You need to bring people on board. You need to put a little bit of time in it, even if it's just sitting on a union membership with a tick that you're affiliated to the Labour Party so you can vote in big elections. But, you know, we just didn't have that foundation. And it's sad to say, I think people's egos got the better of them, and they wanted power instead of organising for a proper change.
Yeah, it's a big difference.
Just to jump in there, I see it slightly differently, as in where we're at now, because I actually think some of the seeds have taken root, and I agree with Nikki, and we talked about this a lot. Like, me and Nikki chat a lot with a small group of our left-wing friends. People are totally disenfranchised, and they are heartbroken by the last election. But after talking to people who were involved in the 90s and 80s, and they were utterly destroyed as a left, right? Like deliberately, maliciously crushed. I think we're better connected. I think social media makes us better connected. I think we didn't do enough political education, but we did do some political education. And I think the left's planted enough seeds, and it'll be some time. But I'm feeling pretty hopeful that we're still, you know, we're chatting to people in Liverpool, up North Bend, you know, we're chatting to people in Bristol, in London, and it's awful. But I don't think we're being broken the way the left was in the 90s and 80s, and I don't think that's possible now. I think we're too connected.
I think what we did with the World Transformed was very good, and it brought people on board. And I've got a 14-year-old daughter she won't say she's not party political at all. She's got her agendas, which she does care about. Like, she's trying to do a campaign to stop herself from having to do GCSEs because she hasn't been to school enough, and that's what she's focusing on at the moment. But I always say to her, look, it's up to you now. In your generation, you have to get involved. And I don't think we really, maybe not in Birmingham, but I don't think we really brought the young people on board enough. A lot of the meetings I was in, I was the youngest person in the room, and I'm 31. You know, we need to bring more people on board and build them up and empower them.
I think I would say, working in education, that I saw a definite change in young people between Ed Miliband and Corbyn. Like, no one really knew who Ed Miliband was. Everybody knew who Corbyn was, definitely, and most of them liked him. Not all of them. Most students, I would say, liked him. I worked with adult learners as well, and I saw a lot more engagement from adult learners too. I think I always see myself as a trade unionist first and a Labour Party member second. And what I would say about everything that happened in terms of people getting out there and getting on the doorstep and so on, is that it has actually built those skills from those trade unionists, in that it's given them confidence. At University of Birmingham, I would say in particular, there are a lot of young activists there who were inspired by Corbyn, who are now really building a fighting branch there and doing a lot of good stuff there. And to me, I'm a Labour Party member. I'm not particularly precious about whether things are happening in the party or in the trade union movement, it's always about collectivism and building critical mass, isn't it? So I think definitely I agree with you, Nikki, that community organising, all that stuff was, I'm not sure, not prioritised, but stamped on a bit, because I can probably speak more freely not being a councillor, by a very organised right wing in the Labour Party. And there was a lot of smearing, and we all know that the West Midlands has been the Labour right stronghold over a period of time in terms of MPs and other people around them. So I wouldn't say that people didn't work hard enough or do the right things. I think they were up against obstacles that we're up against in the workplace and in any other place that we organise. And I think there definitely is hope in terms of what young people as well as other people have brought out of the experience.
Just going back to what Ollie was saying there about people feeling disenfranchised and demoralised and so on, and feeling that there was a bit of a re-emergence of confidence and so on. I mean, I suppose some of it might be that just as social media made us feel like we were more powerful, and in a good way, I think powerful, because people can immediately see this thing building. And I remember sort of in 2015 and 2016, just watching the social media grow was really quite amazing. But then also, I suppose, in a period of crisis, you also have this kind of collective sort of demoralization as well, don't you? And everybody shares it, don't they, on social media? So like I kind of agree with Ollie that I think that actually we're still in quite a good, strong position, and I think in some ways, like, there is a danger that we kind of feed that demoralization. It's hard, isn't it? Because you kind of have to pull the strands together and of political education that people have had, because people have had not just political education as in a kind of learning stuff in an academic sense, but in a experience sense as well. So there's a lot of people saying, well, we're not going to let that happen again, kind of thing, and that's valuable, isn't it? So
yeah. Can I just say something? I mean, around when Corbyn was running for the elections, etc. I did quite a lot of door knocking at that time, and one thing that sort of came through was, this is resident of Wolverhampton, they were confusing what was happening with the National Party happening with the council. That came across quite a bit. Wolverhampton Council, for example, has been a Labour council for a number of years, but at the same time, it's had a lot of cuts. And those cuts, people were feeling directly. So things like council tax had gone up so many years in a row. Housing, not particularly good in Wolverhampton. Youth unemployment, those kind of issues, which they associated by extension with the local council and therefore with Corbyn. So I think they sort of almost attacked Corbyn because they were upset with what was happening at a local level. You marry that with the sort of media campaign has launched, and if you're watching the BBC and you're getting Corbyn being attacked all day long, put the two together, and people will be, hang on, maybe this person isn't the person who's fit to lead us. So a lot of that came about. I remember knocking on one door, and a lady came out, chased me down the street, and said, you can have your effing flyer back, probably vote for them again. And I've been a lifelong supporter of the Labour Party. So I got that a few times, for other people have as well. But, and these were traditional Labour voting areas in Wolverhampton. So I think there was that sort of mix of what was happening in their immediate local sort of day-to-day lives, as well as what they perceived Corbynism to be.
Yeah, sure. And Rhiannon, what are the sort of things that are kind of emerging and happening now in Birmingham and the West Midlands in terms of kind of campaigns that have come either through COVID or sort of more generally?
Well, I think there's probably a couple of big strands in terms of organising that's happened under COVID, and I would say one which traces its way back to a lot of things we've talked about earlier is Black Lives Matter on the street. So that's been the most prolific organising that hasn't been done by, well, obviously Zoom's been involved in setting it up, but there's definitely been street protesting. We had a massive demonstration in Birmingham, but also Dudley, Wolverhampton, West Bromwich have had Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And we've touched on this before, but Birmingham, Black Country definitely bear the scars of really horrific racist policing. If we look at people like Kingsley Burrell, who was a psychiatric patient who was killed in police custody, and in Wolverhampton as well, there is definitely stuff going on there. And so there's a lot of anti-racist organising that's taken place under COVID, and some of it is also to do with the hostile environment. So you may have heard of CME Brown, who's a young boy from Dudley who was arrested under the very controversial joint enterprise legislation, who was present basically when a mobile phone was stolen. He's severely autistic. He needs basically his family around him to care for him. He's had a really bad time in prison, and the government are threatening him to be deported to Jamaica, where he hasn't been since he was 4 years old, and where he would not survive. He needs care. So that's a big local campaign. And again, with the hostile environment, Espoir, LGBT activist locally, is threatened with deportation to Cameroon, where she would face imprisonment for a long period of time. So there's organising around that. In terms of trade union organising, a lot of it has been to do with COVID safety, but there's other stuff going on as well. So my own branch, which hasn't been in action since 2011, so for 10 years, in the pensions dispute, we had a 50% pledge made to students that 50% of education would happen face-to-face last summer, which was to do with marketisation and battles with the University of Birmingham and the posh universities and whatever. That essentially meant that there was a big stick to beat staff with in terms of trying to force as much on site as possible. And so we balloted members, had a consultative ballot and an industrial ballot, and we won that. We smashed the trade union, anti-trade union threshold. So at the moment we're in negotiations there, and that is all about just trying to keep people safe, because our Vice Chancellor often says we're not the University of Birmingham, we're the University for Birmingham, and we just want him to recognise that the university exists in Birmingham, and any on-site transmission has an impact on the working class students who will be on public transport and in multi-generational households, and the staff who will be on site if things are not managed carefully. Other than that, we've got a big dispute at the Heartlands Hospital with porters who are having their contracts ripped up in ways that will really impact on childcare and other issues. And then also, I think GMB hire and refire, which is going on around the country. There's some of that here with the British Gas stuff going on. So there's definitely lots of resistance, and organising is different under COVID because we have to make different kinds of connections with people. Going back to the chain makers, we have to be in our own homes somehow, managing having kids at home and homeschooling and doing our job and organising on top of that. But there is definitely a lot of activity and a lot of people fighting back, I would say.
That's good to hear. And Nikki, I just wanted to ask you a bit about the stuff that you've been doing then, when because obviously that's as you said before, that as something that was kind of like a response to COVID, but it's kind of community organising as well, isn't it?
Yeah, like a community solidarity. When the pandemic struck, we had moms in Birmingham that weren't able to get things for their children because of all the stockpiling. People were taking all the nappies off the shelves. People were taking formula milk because they thought that they could put it in their tea if we went into like an apocalypse. I would not recommend putting formula milk into a cup of tea. I bet it tastes disgusting. So that they were really panicking that they weren't going to be able to feed their babies. So we set up a baby bank. It ran out of my spare room for about 2 months with a band of volunteers, which basically just people I knew. We deliver baby stuff across the city, all across Birmingham, to help these families. And it was from a GoFundMe. We had no funding of any kind at all. and we used to have to make £150 a week, and if we'd made that money, we'd be fine. We could get when the pandemic kind of settled, we could get an Asda click and collect. But in the early days, it was a lot of me going to petrol stations and corner shops and trying to find what they had. It was absolute chaos. And looking back at it now, I can't believe I did it. A year on, we've kind of got a premises and we operate out of an office. We give out equipment to children as well. So pushchairs, cots, clothing, because all the shops are closed. Kids' clothing is an essential, so people aren't able to put clothes on their kids. Baby food, because babies haven't got the food that they need, because babies are really expensive. Like I've got 3 kids. I had my first daughter when I was 16. I don't know how I coped, and I think it was because I had a community around me. I used to live on Benefit Street. Do you know the Channel 4 horrible program they made? I just moved by then, but I used to live on Benefit Street with the people there, and it was a community. It was a family of a street. If you needed something, your neighbour would help you. I had one very well-known resident of Benefit Street. She convinced me to go back to college. She'd help babysit. She'd make a meal for everybody on the street, so we had something to eat. So I think I've had that kind of community drilled into me, and kind of stepping up and helping these families. We help 250 kids a month with the stuff they need. We give them different packs of things, but we gave out nearly 900 packs to kids last month, and that's just early years. And it's we're helping people that are in B&Bs and people with no recourse. It's just madness that it's needed. And as well, we're seeing people as well that a year ago they would never thought they would have needed a food bank. But we're there to help them. We're there to give them dignity, and I'm very proud of what we've achieved.
And you've got a team around you doing that now, have you?
Yeah. So I've got my partner in crime, who helps me, and then we've got like a brilliant band of volunteers. There's one that's 2 volunteers, a brother and sister, and they've done like 500 deliveries in the space of a year. And the baby bank's won on Tuesday. I'm gonna have a little cake for it, but I can't believe it's been a year. Great. And that's only like one of the few things that are happening in Birmingham. I'm sure Ollie can talk about what he's doing in his community and how that's helping. There's so many people that have stepped up to help their neighbours, and maybe people that they've never spoken to before. It's like, I know COVID's horrible and the way it's been handled by the government's awful, but there's been some good aspects, and that's how it's built. I think it's rebuilt some communities.
Yeah, Ollie, do you want to just mention 1 or 2 things that you're doing as well?
Yeah, I can do. Yeah, just to say, I think we should name David as your partner in crime, Nikki, because he would like that shout out.
He probably would, actually.
He would like.
I get all the attention, but he doesn't.
Put it on his Instagram. Well done, David. He's a good lad. So at the same time, Nikki was doing the baby bank. Myself and a group of others set up the Northfield Food Service. So we're sending out 700, 800 meals a week, which is great, right? But it's utterly horrendous. It's needed, and they're all signposted in by schools and the community partnership, which supports people who are struggling, and the project, which supports people who are on the edge of or have experienced homelessness. So it's just like Nikki, it's this weird situation where we're running this good thing for the community, but it's utterly devastating that we need to send out food for families. Like, in how rich our nation is, it's utterly nuts, isn't it? Yeah.
I think the stuff that Ian Byrne's done in the football supporters for food banks, and I'm really glad that I listened to a program yesterday where they had on, and I was really glad that they made that political point, again and again and again. And I think it's really important. It's maybe a difference between, what's happened in the past is that, people have just put sticking plasters on, and there does, it's partly going back to what you said, Ollie, about learning as well. We're not gonna do these things without making the absolute, massively important point that this shouldn't be necessary in the sixth most richest country in the world. But
I think it would be good to big up the Villa, who are my team, and it's a nice year to be a Villa fan this year. And what their fans have done, with fans supporting food banks, I think they've done a great contribution, and they're making a massive difference to the city.
And Kerry's from their group, isn't she? That's
she's from Villa, yeah.
So we're doing a thing like Ian's launched in Liverpool, so we're trying to do that in Birmingham. So Kerry, who Nikki's just mentioned, and Salma, are pulling that together. So we're hopeful to pass a similar motion at our council. But obviously to find ways to make it real, because a declaration by a council or a government doesn't really do anything, really does it, unless you act on it, unless you actually put change in place to provide for the least well off.
We've gone over slightly. We're 9 minutes over our allotted hour, but I think it's important to have discussed those things. And thank you so much, everybody, for those contributions, and also for the amazing work that you're all doing. Before we go, I just think if imagine you're as ignorant as me about West Midlands, Black Country history, and I just wondered if there was things that people beyond Peaky Blinders that people could read and watch and so on. And Ollie, I think you had a couple of suggestions, and then I thought maybe if we could go around if anybody else has got any as well.
Yeah, so first thing I would do if you're watching this and you want to know more is Google Warehouse Cafe. Now it's shut because of lockdown at the minute, but when we're allowed in, go in there. But also they run as Cooperation Birmingham, so lots of good information on there. But if you're in the city, lots to get involved with. And also Google Sing Political, SING, Sing Political. So they do lots of great music, but also they'll share everything that's happening around protests and campaigns and political education in the city as well.
Daminder, did you want to add anything that people might want to read or watch?
I'm not sure about programs. I'd like to know what to watch myself with regards to West Midlands. I do know, for example, Wolverhampton Trades Council's written a sizable book, 100 pages or so, about the history of trade unions in the Black Country. That's worth a read. And I'm sure there's loads of quite good stuff on chain makers. Well, so I know there's a theatre production I went to. It'd be good if that was on YouTube somewhere. That was watching.
Was that one of the Townsend production ones? Was it?
Yeah, Ragged was. Yeah, that's right. And so that would be worth watching if you can get hold of some way of learning social history.
The Trades Council do a brilliant, load of really brilliant history stuff, don't they? That often gets kind of, it gets circulated amongst their members, but we should really try and get them a wider reach, because there's just so much fantastic work they've gone into them. Nikki, was there anything that you wanted to add that people might want to look at?
I think there's a lot of stuff on the internet about the Irish in Birmingham, which I find really interesting, like oral history projects. I think the historian Carl Chin did a lot about that, and it's really good to kind of hear firsthand what happened. Because my family is Irish, so it's good. It's good for me to listen to why they came over, how they built Birmingham, and I think if you're looking for a book, Our City: Migrants and the Making of Modern Birmingham, John Bloomfield, is a very, very good read, and he did a very, very good talk about it too. So that's an excellent book to read.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, I'll try and dig these out and then share them on Twitter as well. Rhiannon, lastly, have you got anything?
Yeah, definitely. So for fiction, I would definitely recommend Sharon Dougal, who wrote the Handsworth Times, which is about growing up in an Asian family in Handsworth. Really beautifully written book. And Kit Duvall as well, My Name is Leon, which is being televised at the moment, about the experience of being a mixed race child black child in the system of being looked after. Chain makers, Tony Barnsley's written a really good book about the chain makers. And in terms of Handsworth, I mentioned Pogus Caesar earlier, was a fantastic photographer of the Handsworth riots. I think there's a short documentary about his photography, but also Cafe Royal books, do one of his books. Shirin Hirsch has written In the Shadow of Enoch Powell, which is about Wolverhampton after the experience of the Rivers of Blood and the legacy politically. And also, it's not a book or a piece of art or anything like that, but I would want to end this just by giving a shout out to Nita Sangira, who was our UCU president-to-be, fantastic Birmingham activist, shared Nikki's love of the villa, and just really an inspiration to anyone and everyone who's worked with her as a sort of form of toughness and the radical love that is the Labour movement.
She's a wonderful woman, wonderful.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, Rhiannon, thank you. Right, okay, well that's takes us to the end of this visit to Birmingham. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, and I think we've kind of scratched the surface, to be honest. So what I would love to do is sort of come back in a few months' time and like pick up some of the pieces, because there's just so much like huge amounts of rich history, isn't there, that when you dig underneath it, oral history and stuff like that. So yeah, well, thank you very much though. That's been a really interesting evening, so thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks for having